recording and go to screen sharing, and we're going to pick up where we left off. And if you remember, we were talking about the class Aves, birds. And recall that one of the things I said is that a lot of biologists don't even consider aves to be their own class. They consider aves to be a subgroup of the class reptilia, reptiles, because there are a lot of similarities between birds and the groups of reptiles that include T-Rex and velociraptors and some of the carnivorous dinosaurs. So they're not always considered to be a separate group. Now, as we've been doing with the other chordates and really all the other animals, we're going to focus on one or two things that are unique in this group or pop up. And one of the things we want to look at is adaptations for flying. You know, think about flying. Metabolically, flying is very demanding. It takes a lot more oxygen per gram of your body weight per minute than walking or even running at full speed does. And even for animals like cheetahs that can run a lot faster than people can. So when we look at birds, one of the ways that birds are able to fly, we'll talk about some others in a moment, but one of the ways that birds are able to fly is because they have a more efficient respiratory system than mammals do. If we look at your lungs, you have a tube called the trachea, and the trachea leads down to your right and left bronchus. You probably heard of people who get bronchitis. That's an infection of one of the bronchuses. So the trachea leads down to the right and left bronchus. Those go to the lungs. And in the lungs, you have some little sacs, kind of like grapes, much, much, much smaller than grapes, called alveoli. And blood vessels flow over the alveoli, and as the blood vessels fall over the alveoli is where the air that you inhale goes. The blood vessels eliminate carbon dioxide and they pick up oxygen. And carbon dioxide goes out of the blood, oxygen comes into the blood just by diffusion. Now, this system of respiration works pretty well, but there is a handicap. When we look at people, we inhale, fresh air comes into our lungs, and that's when we exchange gases. Then we exhale. So this inhalation, exhalation is called a respiratory cycle. And when we look at a respiratory cycle, we're only exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide for half of that cycle. So it's not super efficient. Remember when we talked about digestive systems, we said one of the big advantages of having a complete digestive system with a mouth and an anus is you can have a continuous flow of food through the digestive system. Well, if you have a respiratory system where the air comes in the same way it goes out, you have to stop bringing air in every once in a while to eliminate air. So let's look at how birds do things. Birds do have lungs like people do, but they have some additional organs in their respiratory system that people don't. They have some anterior, or they're sometimes called cranial, air sacs. Cranial indicates they're close to the head. The head is the front part of the body, so that's what anterior means. We have some posterior air sacs, or they're sometimes called caudal air sacs. Caudal means tail. And the first time that a bird inhales, the air mostly goes into the posterior or caudal air sacs. A little bit of the air goes into the lungs. So since the lungs get a little bit of fresh air, they can exchange some oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, when this happens, the air that's in the posterior air sacs and the lungs originally, before this fresh air comes in, that air mostly gets pushed into the front part of the lungs and the anterior air sacs. Now, when the bird exhales, muscles around the air sacs, the posterior air sacs, squeeze them. And as they squeeze them, that compresses them and that pushes air into the lungs. So the lungs had a little bit of fresh air in them. Now they've got even more fresh air. So we can still exchange gases. And then finally, when the bird exhales completely, the air goes out of the anterior air sacs. Now, what's the advantage of this? Notice that there's basically a one-way flow of air, except for this first part of the tube, which is called the trachea, the same name as in people. If we look at the back part, air flows into the posterior air sacs, then into the lungs, then into the anterior air sacs. So a one-way flow in physiological processes is pretty much always superior to a two-way flow. So what this means is birds can extract much more oxygen from the air that they breathe in than you can, or other mammals, not you personally. So when we look at this, birds also have another advantage. Remember when we talked about surface area earlier? If we look at the alveoli, those little grape-like structures on the inside of the lungs, where we actually exchange gases, if we look at those alveoli, they're somewhere between 10 and 100 times smaller on a bird than they are on a mammal. Which means if we look at a bird that's the same size as a mammal, there's somewhere between 10 and 100 times as much surface area in the lungs to exchange gases, to bring oxygen into the blood and to eliminate carbon dioxide from the blood. So more surface area, more gas exchange, so birds can get more oxygen to their cells more quickly than mammals can. Now, what's the long-term consequence of this? Well, you may have seen some kind of special about people climbing Mount Everest, which is the tallest mountain in the world. And when people climb Mount Everest, they usually wear air tanks, like scuba divers do. Because as you go higher and higher up mountains, the air gets thinner and thinner. So it gets harder to breathe. If you've ever climbed any of the mountains out in the Western United States or on one of the other continents, you know that once you get above about 5,000 or 10,000 feet, the air gets thinner, it's harder to breathe. This is one of the reasons why in professional sports, baseballs go farther at Coors Field than they do here at Wrigley Field. The air is thinner, so there's less resistance to a fly ball. It's also why punts go farther in Denver, in Mile High Stadium, than in Chicago. Now, so people can climb Mount Everest. There are a few people who actually climb Mount Everest without wearing oxygen tanks. But when they climb Mount Everest without wearing oxygen tanks, they walk about 20 or 30 yards, and then they stop and catch their breath and breathe hard for a couple of minutes. And then they walk another 10 or 20, 30 yards and stop and catch their breath. And they're not running that 30 yards, they're walking it. The air is so thin to get enough oxygen, it's very difficult. So climbing Mount Everest is really difficult for people. Now, what does this have to do with birds? There are birds that migrate over the top of Mount Everest. They fly over where the people are taking 20 steps and then stopping to catch their breath. So this shows how much more efficient their respiratory system is. Now, the other thing that's important if you're going to fly is you really want to minimize weight. So how can you minimize weight? Well, a lot of birds have hollow bones. The bones don't even contain marrow like we find in mammals. You probably all at some point broken a chicken bone and you've seen that it's hollow on the inside. Why have a hollow bone instead of one that's filled with bone marrow? Reduce weight. So that's one way to reduce weight. Another way that birds reduce weight is if we look at mammals, we've talked all semester, what's the most important thing living organisms have to do? Reproduce. If we look at mammals and most other animals, they have bilateral symmetry. They have a right and a left side that are mirror images of each other. And they basically have two versions of most of their reproductive organs. There might be some reproductive organs like the uterus that's in the middle of the body that there's only one. but there's 2 ovaries, there's 2 testes. If we look at most female birds only have 1 ovary, reduced weight. If we look at people, if we look at your digestive system, and we look at your urinary system, they're both similar in the sense that there are 2 bands of muscles called sphincters in your digestive system and your urinary system. And there's one sphincter, we'll use the urinary system as an example. There's one sphincter right at the base of your urinary bladder, and it's called the internal sphincter. And the internal sphincter is made of something called smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is what we find around your stomach. It's what will make your stomach growl if you haven't eaten in a while. Smooth muscle is found in your blood vessels. It's what helps to maintain your blood pressure. And one of the characteristics of smooth muscle is that it's involuntary. You don't have to think about smooth muscle. It does its job. So the internal sphincter on your urinary bladder stays contracted. And when it stays contracted, it keeps the urine in your bladder. However, when your bladder starts to fill up with urine, at some point the pressure builds and the pressure gets too much for that internal sphincter to take. And so the muscles in that internal sphincter relax and they let the urine out. Now, the good news is you're not going to wet your pants because there's an external sphincter a little bit farther down. And the external sphincter stops the urine from coming out. But there's a problem with the external sphincter. The external sphincter is something called skeletal muscle. And skeletal muscle is voluntary muscle. So the external sphincter, you've probably all been in this situation, the internal sphincter relaxes, and now, if you don't want to wet your pants, you have to concentrate on not letting the urine out. And this is because your external sphincter has taken over, so you have to tell your external sphincter, don't relax, don't relax, don't relax. Well, if we look at birds, birds have no sphincters. In fact, birds don't really have the exact same tube that people do. In a bird, the urinary bladder doesn't come out through a tube called the urethra, like in people. The urinary bladder in birds empties into their digestive system. And their digestive system doesn't really have a sphincter either. In a person, the sphincter in our digestive system means that you have a bowel movement, occasionally. In birds, this is why when they go to the bathroom anywhere. There's no sphincter. So as soon as waste products are formed in the digestive system or in the urinary system, they're eliminated from the body. Now, what's the advantage of this? Why fly around with a bunch of feces in your body waiting to eliminate them for a couple times a day? That's extra weight you're carrying. So birds have several adaptations to help them fly. And the adaptations involve an efficient respiratory system. They also have a 4-chambered heart like mammals do. So they have a complete separation of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. And then they have a lot of weight reducing mechanisms. And keep in mind that birds are not always as heavy as you might think, because there's typically a lot of air under the feathers that provides insulation. Now, if you've ever seen a hummingbird, for instance, hummingbirds are pretty small, but if you look at a hummingbird and had to guess their weight, you'd probably be wrong. Most hummingbirds weigh about as much as a quarter. So they're really very tiny. They look a lot bigger. Why? Because they've got a lot of air for insulation under their feathers. Now, the last group that we're going to look at is mammals. And the class Mammalia includes about 34 different orders, including the one that we're classified in, the Primata, the primates. We're very closely related to another order, the Rodentia, the rodents. And another order, the bats, the Chiroptera, those are both pretty closely related to the Primata. You might not think rodents or bats look a lot like primates, but they're pretty closely related. If we're thinking about the characteristics of mammals, the stuff that we learned way back in grade school is still a pretty good indication of something being a mammal. If we look at the body, we have an insulating layer, but our insulating layer is called hair, not feathers like birds have. Now, over evolutionary time, there are a lot of mammals. Think about people. People don't have very much hair over most of their body. There are some mammals like whales and dolphins that have even less hair than we do. And the other main characteristic of mammals is they suckle their young with milk. So the two things that we learned back in grade school are still pretty good indications that something is a mammal. But there are some more technical definitions. If we look at mammals, mammals have differentiated teeth. And what we mean by this is the teeth have different shapes and actually have different functions as well. If you would look at the teeth in a reptile, the teeth basically all have exactly the same shape. Or if you would look at the teeth in a shark, they basically all have exactly the same shape. But we do have incisors in the front of the mouth. And then we have canines just to the side of that. And then we have some teeth that, depending, are either called bicuspids or sometimes premolars. And then we have molars. The teeth that we call wisdom teeth are actually the last molars. So if we look at mammals, mammals have different teeth. The molars and the premolars, or bicuspids if you prefer, are basically for chewing or grinding our food up. The incisors and canines are more for stabbing our food and tearing it into small pieces. Now, it's a little bit harder with incisors and canines, but especially with molars. If we find the molar of an animal that, especially is a grazing animal that eats a lot of vegetable material, if we find the molars of an animal, we can estimate how old it is by looking at the wear on the molars. If you've ever looked at the molars in your own mouth or in a separate tooth, you know that they have some ridges on them, some cusps. That's why the premolars are sometimes called bicuspids. And as you get older and as you chew food, this food is relatively hard in some cases, those cusps wear down. If you ever watch some of the really old Western movies, when cowboys are going to buy a horse, one of the things they do is they feel the horse teeth, and they're actually feeling the molars. They're trying to see if the molars still have nice high cusps, or if the cusps are worn down relatively flat. If somebody's trying to sell you a horse and the teeth are worn down flat and they're telling you that the horse is a young horse, they're not exactly engaging in truth in advertising. It's an old horse. Of course, there is an old saying among cowboys too that says when you put your fingers in a horse's mouth to see how old its teeth are, make sure that it doesn't bite your fingers to see how many fingers you have. Now, the other main thing we can use to tell mammals on a technical basis is that mammals are a group of vertebrates called synapsids. And synapsids have one temporal fenestra. You've probably heard of your temple. Well, there's actually a bone in that area called the temporal bone. And if we look at vertebrates, there's one group of vertebrates called anapsids. An at the beginning of a word means not. So this is the eye socket in an anapsid. There's no big hole behind that. In a synapsid, the group that mammals are in, there are several small holes, but in the embryo, they all grow together. So there's only one hole in an adult skull. In a diapsid, reptiles are diapsids, two holes remain behind the eye socket. The other thing is embryonic development occurs in the mother's uterus. This is where the placenta is formed. Now, the only exception to this is one of the three groups of mammals called monotremes. Monotremes are sometimes referred to as reptile-like mammals. And there's only two species that are alive today. The duck-billed platypus, there's a picture of one here, and something called the spiny anteater. Now remember, when we talked about animals, we said if you look at all the different phyla of animals, a lot of them are different types of worms. And we said when you look at vertebrates, a lot of the vertebrates are different types of fish. When we look at mammals, a lot of the mammals are different types of anteaters. There's a lot of different ways to be an anteater and survive. If you've ever heard of animals called aardvarks, they mostly eat ants and other insects. Now, if you look at a duck-billed platypus, you can get a little bit of an idea here why it has its name. It does have kind of a duck bill on the front. It's not really exactly the same as the bill that we see in a bird, or the beak, if you prefer. Now, if you would look along the edge of this duck bill, there are actually little sensory organs. And these sensory organs put out an electric current. They don't electrocute their prey, but they use this electric current. They send it out and it works kind of like sonar. When echoes bounce back to the bill produces electric currents, but it can also detect electric currents. And when the echoes bounce back, the platypus tends to live in kind of muddy, scummy water. It can't see very clearly, but it gets an image of its environment by reading these electrical impulses. And it can actually, if there's a worm or something in front of it and the worm is wiggling, it can detect movement. So it can use these electrical impulses to detect prey. Now, if you look at the hind leg that we can see over here on the right side of the body, the hind leg, you can see that it has kind of a webbing in between the toes. So they have a duck bill, they use electrical current, they have webbing. It's hard to tell from this picture, but they actually do have hair, and they lay eggs. So they're really kind of halfway between some of the characteristics that we associate with reptiles and some of the characteristics that we associate with mammals. Now, today there are only two species left, but if we go back and we examine the fossil record, if we look back around the time when dinosaurs were around to the time when dinosaurs became extinct, monotremes were much more common. Now, the two main groups of extant mammals are marsupials and what are usually just called placentals, or placental mammals. Remember, extant is kind of the opposite of extinct. There are still some species in this group around. So monotremes are extant, but they're not considered to be the main group of mammals. Now, if we look at marsupials, the obvious thing that we all know about marsupials is that they spend some of their time in a pouch. This is because they only complete about 1/3 of their embryonic development attached to the mother's placenta. When they're born, they can actually crawl. And when they're born, the embryo actually crawls out of the mother's vagina and it crawls to the pouch. There's a nipple in the pouch in some marsupials, more than one. But in a kangaroo, there's only one nipple, and the little baby, we call it a joey, attaches to the nipple and suckles on the nipple and completes development. Notice that because they only complete about 1/3 of their embryonic development attached to the placenta, when an embryo crawls out of the mother's vagina, it's really tiny. Kangaroos are about the size of deers, roughly, in terms of their weight. And when a deer is born, think about if you've seen Bambi, there's not too much that's biologically accurate in Bambi, but Bambi's about the right size. A baby deer is about the size of, a medium-sized dog, longer legs. But when a kangaroo crawls out of the mother's vagina, it's about the size of a jelly bean. In fact, when kangaroo reproduction was first discovered, it was at a zoo, and a zookeeper was cleaning the kangaroo cage, and the zookeeper saw what he thought was a parasite crawl out of a female kangaroo and crawl into the pouch. And when they checked, they found out it wasn't a parasite, it was a baby kangaroo. Now, again, to reinforce the idea that not everything has a biology that is exactly the same as ours. If you read legends of the Australian Aborigines, legends say that kangaroos can predict the coming of the wet season. You may know that a lot of Australia is a desert, and most mammals have their babies at the beginning of the wet season, typically the spring in this part of the world. Why? Because that's when plants bloom, that's when there's more food available. Well, kangaroos, amazingly, always have their babies, almost always, I should say, within a week or two of when the wet season starts. How can they time things so precisely? Because sometimes the wet season is a little bit earlier, sometimes it's a little bit later. Well, kangaroos can do something that placental mammals like ourselves can't do. After the sperm fertilizes the egg, a kangaroo mother, when the embryo is starting to develop, can hit the pause button and the embryo stops developing. And then when conditions improve, when it starts to get close to the rainy season, the kangaroo mother can hit the play button again and the embryo continues to develop. So since marsupials don't spend a lot of time attached to the mother's uterus, and they might be halfway developed, marsupial mothers almost always have their babies very close to the beginning of the wet season. They can't predict the beginning of the wet season, but if they time their reproduction wrong, or if the wet season is later or earlier than usual, they can kind of adjust the development of the embryo. In a person, that doesn't really work. Notice if you look at the size of this joey, one problem that kangaroo mothers and other marsupial mothers often have is that the baby really doesn't want to leave the pouch. It's a pretty good life. Mom carries you around and does all the work. You don't have to get out, forage for your own food. You're protected from predators. So sometimes the marsupial mothers have to kick the babies out before they'll leave. Now with mammals, we want to look at one of the main characteristics that we associate with being a mammal. And if we look at mammals, and you may not be aware, but birds, these two groups of animals have typically been called warm-blooded, and other animals are generally referred to as cold-blooded. And, as I say here, I'm telling you, we're not going to use these terms again. Cold-blooded animals, a better way to describe them is they're ectothermic and they're heterothermic. So ecto means outside, thermic refers to heat or temperature. So ectothermic animals get the heat to maintain their body temperature from outside of their body. Well, on the earth, that means they get it from the sun. So basically, if ectothermic animals want to warm up, they move into a patch of sunlight. They want to cool down, they move into the shade. If you have pet snakes or lizards or something like that at home, you're kind of aware of this. Your reptiles may not have access to the sun, but you probably have some kind of heat rock inside the aquarium or whatever. Now, these animals are also heterothermic. And heterothermic means that their body temperature varies. Hetero is different. And what does it vary? Well, it varies with the environmental temperature. Now, one of the reasons these animals were originally described as cold-blooded is when scientists were studying them under laboratory conditions, scientists would go home for night. They would turn off all the lights in the lab. Without all the lights, at this time they weren't using heat rocks. The lab would cool down a little bit. The snake or the lizard would get cold. So when they came in the morning, the snake or the lizard would be cold to the touch. So they referred to them as cold-blooded. But if you keep them in warm conditions, their body temperature is actually warm. Warm-blooded animals are more accurately described as being endothermic and homeothermic. Endothermic means the heat for your body temperature, because you're warm-blooded, comes from an internal source. And homeo means constant or the same. So our body temperature stays relatively constant. Now, what's really more accurate, we'll talk a little bit more about these in a moment, but what's really more accurate is to think about being endothermic and ectothermic, or homeothermic and heterothermic, to think about this as kind of a Cartesian plane. So let's just focus on the up and down direction right now, our y-axis. So animals that are very endothermic, that produce their body heat internally, are up near the top of our graph. Animals that are relatively ectothermic, that get their heat from the environment, are down towards the bottom. And right along the x-axis are animals that are a little bit of each. So if we look, notice most birds and mammals are up here kind of in the highest oval. If we go down a little bit lower, we have some small birds and mammals. But notice there are some bees and some insects that are actually mostly homeothermic. Their body temperature is relatively constant. And there are also a few fish that fit into this category. Now, most other animals are down here in the ectothermic category. Now we can think about homeothermic versus heterothermic. So to the right is animals that produce the energy to give them their own body heat. So notice, how do they produce this energy? Through that equation that we talked about back in 105, through aerobic cell respiration. Remember that aerobic cell respiration was carbon dioxide plus oxygen produces, glucose plus oxygen produces carbon dioxide and water. And then we focused on, it also gives an organism energy to rebuild its ATP. But remember, we also talked about the laws of thermodynamics. And the second law of thermodynamics says when you convert energy from one form to another form, that conversion is never 100% efficient. So when we convert energy from chemical bonds in glucose to chemical bonds in ATP, that conversion isn't perfectly efficient. And when energy conversions aren't efficient, the energy that's lost is almost always lost as heat. So animals that are endothermic basically trap the heat that's released during aerobic cell respiration. Animals that are ectothermic can't trap that heat, and it just escapes out into the environment. So notice that if you're endothermic, your body basically works like a furnace. You're using heat that's produced by aerobic cell respiration. So homeothermic animals, animals that have a constant internal body temperature and they're endothermic, think about people. Things that are endothermic and homeothermic, people are, have a high body temperature. You know, Commonwealth Edison would have been overjoyed if you would have kept the thermostat in your house set at 98.6 all winter. You would have had some pretty good heating bills to pay off to them. But notice some organisms, like a lot of fish and invertebrates that live in water in the polar regions, either the Arctic or the Antarctic, have a body temperature that's homeothermic, but it's relatively low. Because if they're ectothermic and homeothermic, and you live in the oceans in the Arctic or Antarctic area, that water is very cold. So those animals have a constant low body temperature. Now, heterothermic animals live in environments where the temperature fluctuates. And heterothermic organisms, notice there are none of them that are very endothermic. And that's because if you're endothermic, you're going to have a steady body temperature. But if you're ectothermic, then your body temperature depends on the body temperature or the environmental temperature around you, because you're absorbing heat from that environment. So if we look at these groups have some advantages. Now, like most things that we see in biology, we tend to think that the way that people are designed is what's best. We're endothermic and homeothermic. But notice there's a huge handicap to being endothermic and homeothermic. Think about what I just said about Commonwealth Edison. Body temperature 98.6 degrees. It takes a lot of food to maintain a body temperature of 98.6 degrees. And if you think about what we discussed in terms of surface area and volume a few days ago, small mammals have an even bigger problem. If we look at the smallest mammals, which are some mammals called shrews, again, there are some shrews that weigh about as much as a quarter. If a shrew doesn't eat for 4 or 5 hours, it starves to death. It burns up any fat reserves that it might have stored. Its body starts digesting its own muscles. It dies. The same thing is true with hummingbirds. They can last a little bit longer, typically about 8 or 10 hours. But if a hummingbird is awake and active for 10 hours and it doesn't eat, it will starve to death. Now, people aren't quite that bad, but we still eat quite a bit. So if it costs so much in terms of how much food you have to consume, what's the advantage of being endothermic and homeothermic? Well, the main advantage is you're going to have a higher body temperature. Why does that matter? Well, because if we study chemical reactions, and keep in mind, metabolism is really just chemical reactions occurring in cells. When we study metabolic reactions, for about every 10 degrees Celsius, that's about 18 degrees Fahrenheit, when body temperature goes up 10 degrees Celsius, the rate of metabolism doubles. So if we look at an animal who has a body temperature 20 degrees Celsius higher than another animal, the metabolism is doubled, then it's doubled again. So it's 4 times faster. Why would you want to have a fast metabolism? The faster your metabolism, the more active you can be. Animals that have very slow metabolism generally are not very active. They can be active for short periods of time, but they can only be active for short periods of time because they generally have to rely on anaerobic metabolism. So if we look at animals that are ectothermic and heterothermic, things like freshwater invertebrates and fish, you know, what's the advantage of this? You have a low body temperature, you can't be real active, or sometimes to become active, you have to warm up. There are some insects that when they're going to get ready to fly, crawl into a patch of sunlight. So they heat their body up. They start flexing their wings. They start doing some warm-up exercises, if you will. So to be active, they've got to warm up. So why have a low body temperature? Because you don't need as much food. That's a huge advantage. in nature, the problem that most living animals have with food is not being able to get enough and potentially starving to death. So, you know, if we look at snakes, I used to have a boa constrictor, and by the time the boa constrictor got to be about 7 or 8 years old and about 6 feet long, it used to eat a rat or two, but it only ate once every 3 or 4 weeks. So the advantage of having a relatively low body temperature, you don't have to eat nearly as much food. The disadvantage, you can't be active unless you either raise your body temperature or you're active for just a very brief period of time. So there are pluses and minuses to both of these kind of strategies, if you want to think of them that way. But notice that some homeothermic animals have high body temperatures, some have low body temperatures. Some are more endothermic, some are more ectothermic. So we really want to think of these in kind of separate categories. Endothermic, ectothermic is separate from homeothermic, heterothermic. We don't want to leap to any conclusions about them. Now, there's one more topic we want to look at before we leave animals, and that is, how is body temperature regulated in endothermic organisms? And the real key is a part of your brain called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus works like a thermostat in your house. You know, if you have a thermostat, you might have it on heat right now, depending, or you might be turning on heat soon since it's supposed to get cold and snow later. But if you look at how a thermostat works, if you have the temperature in your house set to 68 degrees, the thermostat has a thermometer in it. And when the temperature drops below 68 degrees, the thermostat sends a signal to the furnace, starts the furnace heating the air in your house. The air heats up over 68 degrees if that's where the setting is. And then the thermostat sends a signal to the furnace and the furnace stops. So if you would look at a graph of the temperature in your house and you have your thermostat set at 68 degrees, the temperature in the house is not always 68 degrees. Kind of depends on how sensitive your thermostat is, but basically, if your thermostat is set to 68 degrees, the temperature goes up to 69 or 70 degrees, then it starts gradually decreasing and it goes down to 67, 66, and then the furnace kicks in again and it goes up again. So if we look at it, the temperature looks kind of like a sine wave that you might see in a math class. And it goes slightly above 68, slightly below 68. But notice in the thermostat in your house, you can change the setting. Now, the hypothalamus in your brain works the same way. The hypothalamus monitors receptors that are telling it the temperature of blood flowing through the brain. And it also monitors the receptors that are telling it the temperature of your core, your torso, your digestive organs, your heart, your lungs. And it also has receptors that tell it the temperature of your extremities, your fingers, your toes. And the hypothalamus, like a thermostat in your house, has a setting. So what happens if you're hot? Now, the first thing is we have to keep in mind why you feel hot, why your hypothalamus thinks you're hot. And it's not necessarily because you have a fever. The hypothalamus tells the rest of your body, it tells your brain you're hot whenever the temperature that it's monitoring is higher than the hypothalamus setting. So if the hypothalamus is set for 98.6 degrees and your temperature is 99 degrees, the hypothalamus tells your body that you're hot. If your hypothalamus is set for 98 degrees and your body temperature is 98.6, the hypothalamus tells your body you're hot. So if your actual body temperature is higher than the setting, the hypothalamus thinks you're hot and it activates cooling. Now, remember what we were just saying. For animals that are endothermic and homeothermic, their body works like a furnace. So you don't really have a real efficient way of cooling. You have one main way of cooling your body down if you feel hot. The blood vessels going to your skin dilate. That means they get wider, so more blood goes to your skin. Well, one of the things that blood transports around your body is heat. So you're sending more heat to your skin. Your sweat glands are activated and your sweat glands release sweat onto the surface of your skin. And then this heat from the blood that you're sending to your skin is used to boil away the sweat. The sweat evaporates. And when the sweat evaporates, the sweat carries some of this heat with it. And when the sweat carries away body heat, your body temperature drops. Now notice that sweat that's dripping off of you on a hot summer day doesn't really cool you. The sweat has to evaporate to do an effective job of cooling you, because the sweat that evaporates carries away a lot of body heat. Sweat that drips off of you doesn't carry off very much. One way to think about why sweat is effective is if you've ever been cooking and you've gotten burned with some steam. You know that steam carries a lot of heat energy. Sweat is basically steam. Now, what happens if your body temperature is lower than the setting in the hypothalamus? The hypothalamus activates warming, which consists of two main things. First of all, the blood vessels in the skin do the reverse. The blood vessels that lead to your skin constrict, so less blood flows to your skin. Now, if this happens for too long, it can be dangerous, because one of the main places that lose body heat is your extremities, your fingers, your toes, your nose, your ears. Because, think about the extremities. In your extremities, in your fingers, in your ears, you have a very high surface area to volume ratio. So you exchange a lot of heat. So what's one of the problems when the blood vessels to the skin constrict? You could end up getting frostbite in your fingers or your toes or your ears. Those are usually the first places of your body that feel cold when you're standing out in the cold weather. Now, since the way that you generate more heat is by aerobic cell respiration, and most of the heat for your body is generated from skeletal muscles, the hypothalamus causes the skeletal muscles to contract. Now, skeletal muscles normally move your body. So when the skeletal muscles contract, it's really the heat that we're interested in, but because the skeletal muscles normally move your body, they can also cause you to shiver a little bit. So the skeletal muscles contracting, restricting the flow of blood to the skin, this increases your body temperature. But keep in mind, the hypothalamus is crucial in all this. And, well, let's look very quickly at an example. You've probably had a fever at some point when you were sick, or maybe somebody else you've been taking care of has had a fever. And one of the things you've noticed is that when you have a fever, a lot of times the person who's sick is saying, put another blanket on me, I feel really cold. Well, if you have a fever, how can you feel cold? Well, let's go back to this hypothalamus. Remember, the hypothalamus tells you you're cold if the body temperature is lower than the setting in the hypothalamus. And one of the things that happens when you get an infection, to increase your metabolism, a lot of times the temperature in the hypothalamus, the setting, is turned up a degree or two. So if your body temperature is 99 degrees, but the hypothalamus is set for 100 degrees, the hypothalamus is telling you you're cold. It's only 99 in here. It should be 100. We're freezing. So you want another blanket. You want something warm to eat. So notice that the same thing happens sometimes when you get up in the morning. When you fall asleep, the hypothalamus setting usually gets turned down anywhere from about 1/2 degree to 2 degrees, depending on the person. So when you wake up in the morning, your hypothalamus has been at 97 degrees all night. And you wake up, the hypothalamus gets reset to 98.6, and it says, oh, we're freezing in here. The blood is only 97. So sometimes even in the middle of summer, you wake up in the morning or maybe in the middle of the night and you're cold. Why are you chilly? Because the hypothalamus is set for a higher temperature than the body temperature. So the hypothalamus is usually what's causing a fever or causing you to feel cold. Now, one of the studies has shown that if you want to feel warmer and you're chilly, wear socks. If you go barefoot, your hypothalamus gets signals from your feet that they're cold. So what does it do? It starts restricting blood flow to the feet. And if you start restricting blood flow, they start to get even chillier typically. So we'll finish up with chordates tomorrow. Are there any questions before we quit today? Or Wednesday, I said tomorrow. Okay, if there are no questions, I'll go ahead